Okay, hi everyone. Back again for another episode of Science and Technology Q&A for kids and others. I might say that I am thinking about doing some of these on different topics, including some about history and so on. And if people are interested in that, let us know. And I'd be happy to try and answer questions about things I know about the history of science and technology, both from experiences I've had and from the things I've studied, but that's a different topic. Okay, we have a few questions that were left over from last time. There's one here from Lauliette. Do I think that neurons work more as mechanical systems or on the quantum level? Is the computational power done by a neural net or more by the neurons themselves or more by microtubules? Okay, let's see what I can do with that. So what we're talking about here is kind of how do brains work and what matters in the way that brains work. So what's in our brains? Well, there's a lot of nerve cells. There's maybe 100 million nerve cells in our brains. And the nerve cells are these things which have kind of a body, and they have long spindly arms that look kind of a little bit like wires. And sometimes nerve cells will have 1,000 of these spindly arms, maybe even 10,000 of these. And these sort of spindly arms reach out across to lots of other neurons. So there's this big network of neurons in our brains that is the way that we process information. Now, how does this actually work? Well, there are electrical signals generated by these neurons. And what happens is, neuron is like a little tiny electric battery. It's a little tiny electrochemical system that is basically generating pulses of electricity. And what's happening is when a nerve cell gets to the point where it's been excited enough by other nerve cells that it is touching, then it will produce a pulse of electricity, which it then sends to other nerve cells that it's touching. And that's roughly how the basic idea of how neurons work. Now, neurons have on these little sort of spindly arms, they have what are called dendrites and what are called axons. The axons are the places where the nerve cell is kind of sending out pulses of electricity. The dendrites are the places where it's receiving them. And in general, they're what are called synapses, which are the junctions between nerve cells, where arms from different nerve cells match up. And at those synapses, the actual way that the sort of pulses of electricity are sent through are through these molecules called neurotransmitters, of which there are several, things like acetylcholine, serotonin, dopamine. These neurotransmitters have slightly different chemical characteristics, slightly different kinds of cells that sort of specialize in producing that neurotransmitter, and slightly different effects if you take all kinds of weird drugs and things, they'll have all kinds of effects on different levels of these neurotransmitters in your brain. And also different diseases have effects on populations of nerve cells that are associated with particular neurotransmitters and so on. But so the basic idea is nerves in our brains all the time, they are basically firing in the sense that they're producing these pulses of electricity that they send to other nerve cells and so on. And this happens roughly 1,000 times a second, roughly. And if you can record electrically from even a single nerve cell, in some organisms it's pretty easy. Like the squid has the giant axon, which is a particularly big nerve, which makes it particularly easy to record from. But it's possible to record from nerve cells in lots of organisms. And in humans, it's more difficult because we don't tend to have. There's all kinds of questions about how we might do it in humans. You can do a certain amount of if you put the electrical connections, on your scalp, you can record EEG. But that's a very mushed out version of the electrical activity of your brain. You can detect at the microvolt level, you can detect some electrical activity, but what you're detecting by just having 12 electrodes on your head or something is the collective effect of billions of neurons, not the individual kind of more information processing effects of individual neurons. But in any case, so if you record from a single neuron, you will find usually that the thing is kind of quiescent. It's not making any, you turn the electrical signal into a sound, it'll be like quiescent, and then suddenly it'll wake up and it'll have a whole burst of, buzz, kind of bursts where it produces a spike train of lots of pulses of electricity generated by the nerve cell 1,000 times a second, and then maybe it'll go quiet again for a while and then it'll start up again. And if you kind of record those things, it's like, what's actually going on here? What is how do we read out the electrical signals from our brains and find out what they mean? Well, it's pretty difficult. We could imagine doing the same thing with a computer. We could imagine tapping into the electrical signals in a computer. Back in the day, and I haven't tried this recently, if you've got an old analog radio and you held it up near your computer, you should be able to hear a little bit like the EEGs from our brains, sort of the collective effect of all of the various electrical things that are going on in your computer, transmitted as electromagnetic radiation and picked up by radio. I haven't tried them in a long time. Back when I first used computers, like 45 years ago, that was a really common thing to do. You could really tell what was going on in your computer by whether it made all these weird squawking sounds and so on when you held up a radio to it. Don't know whether that still works. Depends on the shielding on these computers, and among other things. But in any case, the thing that individual nerve cells, you see all these electrical signals going back and forth. What does it all mean? Well, it's complicated. And it's not easy to decode what it means. And between different people, for sure, the details of what different nerve cells there are and exactly what signals they produce will be completely different. So now a question is, okay, are these electrical signals between nerve cells, are they the whole story of the way information is processed in our brains? Or are there other kinds of things going on? So one big feature of our brains is memory. And the question is, in this network of nerve cells, how do we have memory? And kind of I think the sort of the main theory, which seems to be correct, is that at the synapses between nerve cells, there are little channels that are things like calcium channels and so on, almost little tiny rocks that are developed by the presence of but by when a memory is formed, what's happening is that you're changing the amount of the way that different nerve cells interact. So it's as if you're changing the kind of how much effect one nerve cell will have on another. At the lowest level, maybe there are on the order of maybe 100 trillion different synapses in the brain, different sort of places where you can store this information about how much effect should one nerve cell have on another. And that those 100 trillion places where you can store that, those are presumably what stores all of our memories. And what seems to happen is that at first, when a sort of memory is first formed, it's formed in a very fragile way with particular molecules in the synapse. And then over the course of time, over the course of, I think 15 minutes, maybe, and then there's another process, takes hours or a day, you get sort of long-term memory that's formed that at some level is like these little tiny channels that will either let through neurotransmitter or not, and so on, between these nerve cells. And so that's sort of one theory for how brains work is it's just the electrical activity of the nerve cells. It's just these memories stored in synapses and so on. But it's never been clear whether that's the whole story or whether there's other kinds of effects, other kinds of features of nerve cells beyond their sort of overall electrical activity that are important in the way that brains work. Now, we're getting a little bit of circumstantial evidence that sort of it's just the electrical activity of nerve cells, and it's just whether a nerve cell is firing or not, and it's just the effect of one nerve cell on another, that's the whole story from artificial neural nets. Artificial neural nets are just representations in a computer of things where you have essentially an artificial neuron, and it has lots of effects from other neurons, and they are just numbers, and there's a certain weight for every effect from every other neuron. And when in a first approximation, when the amount of stuff coming from other neurons exceeds some threshold, then a particular neuron will fire and it will send its data to other neurons. That's implemented just typically in software or now a little bit in hardware, in neural networks, artificial neural networks used for deep learning and so on. The details of the way that works are a little different from the way things work or appear to work in actual brains. There are ways that one can train an artificial neural network by giving it a whole bunch of samples and by back propagating kind of the effect of errors back into the kind of the way that one programs things and so on. It's a kind of mathematical process based on calculus that doesn't seem to be quite the same as the way that brains do it, or hasn't seemed to be quite the same. But what's become somewhat clear in recent years is that the things one can achieve with artificial neural networks, the ways one can let's say, recognize objects or do various kinds of tasks, are pretty similar to what brains manage to do. And it seems like one has managed to capture with artificial neural nets the core characteristics of lots of things that brains do. So that's kind of a bit of evidence, circumstantial evidence, that we really did nail by thinking about just neurons and electrical connections between neurons, that's kind of the whole story of what's happening in brains. Now, there are some other theories that have been floating around about other things that could be going on in brains. For example, one theory is, oh, we're not just storing memories in these things like these channels and the synapses. We actually have molecules, like even DNA molecules, that are part of storing memories in brains. That's one possible theory. Another theory is that these things called microtubules, which exist in many cells, which are little protuberances out of in the boundary of the cell that can have very complicated behavior. So they're almost like little hairs on the surface of the cell, very tiny, made of a small number of molecules. And you can have these whole collective effects where you have this sort of wave of stuff going around microtubules. Now, microtubules can be important in, for example, when organisms grow, there are places where microtubules are almost like a sort of little tiny arms that reach out and grab other cells and move the cells into position and do all kinds of things. Microtubules are sort of powerful ideas in biology, and it's been thought possible that they might have something to do with the operation of the brain. I don't think it's all that likely, and I think it's becoming less likely as we see the extent to which artificial neural networks succeed in doing rather brain-like things. Another thing that's been sort of a possibility is that the brain makes strong use of quantum mechanics. In ordinary mechanics, one is thinking, you know, there are always definite things that a system does. In quantum mechanics, kind of the idea is there's a whole collection of possible histories which all simultaneously happen, and we just get to find the chance that one thing happened rather than another. It's kind of this thing where there's a sort of an automatic parallelism that's going on that leads to ideas like quantum computers and so on. I'm a little bit skeptical about those for all sorts of reasons. There's sort of ideas that this quantum mechanics might be important in the brain. I kind of doubt it. I suspect that that's not the case, that really this model of neurons that basically fire or don't fire have effects from other neurons, that's probably more or less right. And by the way, one of the things that always helps in terms of making models for things that compute is that, in a sense, all computers at some level are equivalent, in the sense that you can program one computer to do whatever you can program any other computer to do. So even if our brains are made in one particular way, in principle, our brains are programmable to operate in some other way. Now, for example, with our brains, if we say, let's do the kinds of things that computers that sit on our desks do very well, let's do them with our brains. Some of those things are pretty hard for us to do with our brains in practice, although they are possible for us to do with our brains, whether it's working out some complicated math thing that, you know, in my distant past, I spent lots of effort making it so we didn't have to do those things with our human brains anymore. We could just get computers to do them because computers tend to be better at doing those. But still, in principle, we can do them with our brains. Let's see. All right, we got a lot of questions here. So, gosh, there's a question from Jack Bound. It's been argued that the majority of published research findings in science are false. They ask, since I've obviously read lots of research papers, what's been my experience? Are there fields where academic research is generally of higher quality? That's an interesting question. So there are, I don't know how many papers published a year now, maybe 1 million. And they are written by people with differing amounts of experience, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And also with, if you're a professional scientist, professor, whatever, it's kind of like you should write X number of papers per year or you're not doing your job. Now that X varies from field to field. Like I think in mathematics, it's quite low. In something like biomedical science, it's quite high in terms of number of papers you should publish. There are also very different conventions in terms of, are there papers that are just written by one person, or are there papers always written by a team of 5 or a team of 100? When people put their names on the papers, did everybody who wrote put their name on the paper do a lot of work? Did some of the people do much less work? It varies from field to field. There are different conventions about how this works. The question is, how do you get the right answer in these papers? Because science is hard, and sometimes I think that the system that has developed over the last it's basically scientific papers have sort of existed as a kind of a thing since about the 1600s. The late 1600s was when the first scientific journals came into existence. It's kind of fun to read some of the early ones because they're very much more like modern blog posts. They're very much more informal. They're very much more things like, well, I went up to the top of this mountain and I tried to see this green flash that happened, but it was cloudy that day, so I didn't get to see it. Rather than a modern scientific paper, which is much more formal, the kind of thing I just mentioned is more what you would see in something like a blog post today. I think it really helps communication to have some of that informal stuff because it explains to you things like, why did the people do this? What problems did they run into? Whereas often in modern scientific papers, all that people do is to say, this is what we did. And if something went wrong, it's like, well, you don't publish that in the paper. And that's one of the issues, is that it tends to be the case that, if you try and write a paper that says, I tried this experiment and it didn't work. Well, people say, well, you can't publish that paper. You don't have anything to say. Well, in some sense, you really do have something to say, because the next people who come along and wonder, well, is that experiment worth doing? What would happen if I did that experiment? They would, if your paper was published and they could find it, they'd be like, oh, okay, that person tried it and it didn't work. Now, by the way, this person X tried it and it didn't work story can get complicated, because sometimes people will try and do an experiment. It doesn't work. Well, it didn't work because of some detail that people didn't really quite understand. They didn't know it was important that they, let the mouse chill out for an hour before they ran it through a maze, or that they didn't put something in, that something was supposed to be in water rather than not being in water, whatever else. So lots of details that they might not have thought of. And so when somebody says, oh, it didn't work, somebody tried it and it didn't work, you have to know a lot more to be sure that it really didn't work, so to speak. Well, now there's when you look at scientific papers, there are, it's one of the things which I always think is a sort of a curse in experimental science, particularly, is when you do an experiment and it's not really clear whether there's an effect, and you have to use statistics to tell you whether there's an effect. So in modern times with automated data taking, it's really common to say, I'm going to measure something and I'm going to get 1 million measurements. By the time you have 1 million measurements, usually something is either obviously happening or obviously not happening. And if you draw a plot of your measurements, you'll either see that bump somewhere or you'll see this segregation of points or whatever, and it'll be pretty obvious. But let's say that you only had 200 points, so you only had 100 points, and you plot them and they all look kind of random. And it's like, well, is there an effect or is there not an effect? Well, you have to start saying, well, there's slightly more points to the left of this line or to the right of this line. Is the number of points more, because when you throw down the points randomly, there'll always by chance be some imbalance between the number of points on the left and the right, for example. Is the imbalance that we have more than we would expect just by random chance, or less than we would expect just by random chance? And that quickly turns into a whole elaborate kind of mathematical theory of statistics. Most of that mathematical theory was actually developed in the 1930s, long before people really had the good ability to do sort of large-scale data taking, visualizations by computer, things like that. It was a sort of a mathematical technology created to kind of tease out an effect when you didn't have very many data points and when it was really hard to do it. Much of it was developed for agricultural investigations, where people would say, we have this crop, we put down this fertilizer in this part of the field, we put down another fertilizer in the other part of the field, which, how much does this fertilizer really have a positive effect or not? So that led to things called p-values, for example. Those are a little bit more modern than that, but they arose from that kind of investigation, which is kind of gives you estimates of sort of the probability that what you would see is not what you would think what you would see just by pure chance, the probability that there's sort of really an effect. So now if you look at, for example, in medical papers, they'll always be quoting p-values, and they'll always say we have certain sort of critical p-values that we've achieved, which are sort of the test for whether the effect was real or not. Unfortunately, to roll in all of that mathematical statistics from 1930s, you have to make a bunch of assumptions about the true nature of your data. For example, you have to assume that everything is kind of, if you randomly pick things, that the values you'd get from randomly picking them fall on a Gaussian bell curve type shape. So, if you look at human heights, for example, in a pretty good approximation, you get a collection of people, the probability that somebody will have a certain height is roughly distributed according to this Gaussian bell curve shape. But other kinds of things are absolutely not distributed that way. But usually the methods that are used for doing the statistical analysis have to assume that everything is distributed that way. So that's one of many reasons why they'll tend to get the wrong answers. And so that's a horrible and challenging thing, that you'll see these things that look very scientific and look very kind of, oh yes, we've got precise results, we've got a p-value of whatever, we've got something happening at this confidence level, blah 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 blah, and it looks very precise. But if you peel it all out, it's actually something that where it's really hard to know whether that's the right conclusion. If you could see the raw data and plot it, and it's obvious, oh, all these points lie on that side of the curve or whatever, then great, you know what you're doing. But there's a tendency to try and wrap these things in, particularly mathematical statistics, and make it seem like it's very precise with all kinds of numbers. But in fact, it's kind of hiding the fact that there really isn't enough data to make a good conclusion and so on. So it's very challenging. I think in the biomedical area, particularly challenging in that regard. I think in the case of other fields and more theoretical fields, there are different kinds of things that happen. I mean, in more theoretical fields, one of the things that can happen is papers can get extremely technical. Like you look at this thing and it's like, what on earth are these people talking about? I think I know this field, but what are these people talking about? Sometimes the papers are not very well written in terms of exposition. Often one of the problems is that they don't say why they're doing things. They just say, consider this, 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 and this. Okay, then this happens. It's like, okay, you get to I'm looking towards the end of the paper and it's like, why do we care? What's going on? And it's like you get to the end of the paper and it's like, oh gosh, they got to the end of the paper and they still didn't say why we cared. So, but it can be very technical, and sometimes it can be very technical and just completely wrong, because somebody had built this sort of technical tower and didn't really understand all the details of it, and it ended up just going off in the wrong direction. I think that one can imagine a world in which, for example, for mathematical papers, one can imagine a world in which machines could check these papers, in which they're kind of written out in a sufficiently formal way that one can have a machine say, does this follow, does this step follow from this step? Unfortunately, there's sort of a trade-off, because when you do that, you're essentially writing a piece of code that is very, very low-level code that is perhaps understandable to the computer, but absolutely incomprehensible to the humans. When you give the big picture of the big sort of narrative of what's happening, that's something where humans can get something out of it and can understand what's going on, but being able to sort of automatically check it is not something that you have. Now, in a sense, a lot of what I've tried to do with our computational language is to provide a kind of a sufficiently high-level computational way to represent things that it's both understandable to humans and runnable by computer and checkable by computer. And I think that's kind of, as I see it, and unfortunately I've been seeing it this way for 30 years, so it's always very frustrating when you can see what has to happen, but you wait 30 years to make it actually happen, is increasingly this notion of computational papers in which you're writing out things as pieces of computational language so that they're things that can be explicitly run as well as just read by humans. But it's got to be the case that they're both readable by humans and runnable by computer, not a big wall of code that where you look at it as a human, it's like, well, I don't know if this is right or wrong. And another thing that comes up is the data that is the backup for papers. Often there's been sort of an idea, you know, some government will say, we supported the work on this paper, we paid for the work on this paper, therefore we want you to make the data from this paper available to everybody. And people say, well, in principle they do that, but in practice it doesn't work out. In practice, you go to the place where you're supposed to collect the data and you find a word processing file that has some stuff in it. You can't tell what's going on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Another thing that we spend a lot of effort on is to make our computational language such that you can really make data computable so that you can like take your raw data of all those measurements that you so carefully made and actually put it in like our data repository in a form where other people can do computations from it and you can do computations from it in the future. And those are things that I think can really help in the sort of reproducibility and correctness of things in science. But you know, the number one problem, I suppose, is that, you know, maybe there are 1 million papers published, but I think that the fraction that really people think, oh, this is really interesting, is quite small, and a large number of those papers, sadly, will be read by almost nobody. Now, it's a cool achievement, and it's something, honestly, I sometimes feel like I write things down because that way, at least I'll be able to find them in the future. Even if nobody else ever reads this thing, at least I'll know I wrote down this argument or this result somewhere, and that's useful to me. And that's not a bad thing to be doing. And if other people read it, well, great, that's a bonus, so to speak. All right, let's see. Oh, so many questions. You guys ask just, oh, there's a question here about, gosh, so many questions. All right. It's a question here from Lauliette. Is it possible to slow climate change by creating like a layer of clouds to lower the temperature a bit? Okay, so first thing to say about climate change is the history of our planet has been one in which the climate gradually changes. Things change. You know, us humans probably have no doubt have some effect on changing the climate, but the climate's going to change anyway. And, you know, it has done over the course of recorded history. There have been times when it's been super cold all winter, times when it's been warmer. Even in the 1600s, it was, you know, there were periods of time when it was sort of a little ice age and it was really cold for a while, and, you know, things change. And one of the things I think that has, and no doubt we have an effect on the rate at which certain things are changing, but things change anyway. One of the things to realize about modern times is that it is much more difficult for us to deal with change today than it probably was even a few hundred years ago. Because today, you know, we've built up all these cities, we've got real estate values, we've got all the structure that we built. And if it turns out that, you know, Cape Cod in Massachusetts is washed away by the ocean, or, you know, Florida has, you know, the ocean rises and beachfront is no longer beachfront and so on, that's a big deal for us today. Maybe 500 years ago, people would just say, well, you know, whatever, you know, over the next generation, they'll probably move inland a bit and it's not really a big deal. And we'll pick things up and move them. But now, you know, we've got a society and a civilization where we've really relying a lot on the way things are right now. And so if we can like change, you know, if things are going to change, well, that's a problem. But I think one thing to realize is it's just the nature of, you know, a planet, so to speak, that things change. Now, if we say, okay, we really, really don't want things to change, let's lock it in so nothing changes. Whether we're causing the change, whether the change is just happening naturally, doesn't really make any difference. We could still say, let's try and lock in no change. Now, some people might not like it. I mean, people might say, well, I'd prefer it if it was warmer in the, where I live. And other people say, whatever, But let's assume that we wanted to just lock it in, no change. Could we do that? Could we, in a sense, do the kind of the geoengineering necessary to make it so that there really isn't any change? Well, there are a bunch of ideas for how one might do that. It's always very concerning because one says, let's make a change to our whole planet. Well, that's, it's like, well, it may benefit somebody, it may not benefit somebody else. It's hard to agree on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But still, from a pure science point of view, we can say, what could we do to change the climate of our planet? Many proposals. So there are things that involve putting layers of aerosol into the upper atmosphere. So one of the big issues is, how much does the sun heat our planet? And the sun might heat our planet more or less depending on how much heat the sun is putting out. So for example, one of the things that happened in the 1600s was there were very few sunspots, which probably meant that the amount of something to do with the layers of outer the layers of turbulence in the outside of the sun that were different, and the total heat output from the sun was probably slightly different, and that probably cooled the earth slightly. Maybe, I'm not sure that's correct, but that's a theory. And so one thing is, maybe there are changes in the sun that can change the amount of energy that's coming from the sun to the earth. There are also slight changes to do with, and how long is it? 46,000 year cycle, I think, to do with the orbit of the earth, to do with the earth ending up being more closer or further from the sun by a small amount. Those can have an effect as well. So that's first thing. And we don't get to go and adjust the sun. So anything we do has to be something we do more locally. But the big thing tends to be how much heat energy comes from the sun and makes it to the surface of the earth. And so and then how much of it is radiated back from the surface of the earth back into space. And so that's where it really matters whether you have, the so-called greenhouse gases, which prevent radiation back into space and so on, things like this. But so one way that you can adjust the amount of heat energy that's coming to the surface of the earth is you just put a thin layer of something that reflects the light and the heat back out of the earth, away from the earth, and you put that thin layer in the upper atmosphere of the earth. So that's one possible way to do it. People talk about also just putting, giant mirrors into Earth orbit. I don't know how much of an effect that has, and I don't know how many you have to have before that's really significant. People talk about, there's so many of these proposals. There's a lot of stuff to do with reducing the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere. Plants use up carbon dioxide and produce oxygen, and us animals and so on, and our machines and so on tend to consume oxygen and produce carbon dioxide. So, right now I think there are about 2 trillion trees on the surface of the earth. If you put more trees on the surface of the earth, you can eventually ingest more carbon dioxide. You can also have a variety of more chemical schemes for a machinery that will just ingest carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and do things with it. I think one proposal I saw recently was taking the mineral olivine, which is a very common mineral in the Earth's surface, and when it reacts with seawater, apparently it can ingest lots of carbon dioxide. And so that one proposal was you just scatter olivine on beaches all around the earth. Olivine happens to be a green mineral, so that's a kind of gives you a cool coloring as well. Then the interaction of the olivine with the seawater will allow a chemical reaction in which carbon dioxide is kind of ingested and turned into calcium carbonate. I don't know if that fully works. It's always hard to know with these schemes. You have to do a lot of calculations to work out what effects they have. Another one that was popular for a while was the idea of seeding the Southern Ocean with iron, because one of the things that also can ingest carbon dioxide is plankton, tiny microorganisms in the ocean that sort of do the same kind of thing that plants do, and ordinary land plants do, and ingest carbon dioxide. But the question is, how do you get more plankton to exist in the oceans? And I think the basic idea was you feed them with iron, which is one of the nutrients that they don't have enough of in the ocean. You just go with a ship and you just, you know, spew out lots of iron into, I think, particularly the Southern Ocean. I don't know why the Southern Ocean is the right one to do it in. But that was another possible scheme. There are a whole variety of these kinds of schemes. You know, many of them would probably work. It's a little bit concerning to imagine actually deploying one of them, because, you know, what one has to do is calculate what effect will that have on the Earth. You know, if one changes it in this or that way, how much will that change these wind currents that do this? How much will that change these ocean currents that do that? How much will it increase the way that clouds in the tropics dump rain or whatever else? It's hard to know. And the computer models that one has for working these things out are complicated. And in fact, there are some sort of fundamental problems in kind of being able to make long-term predictions for how systems like climate will work. There are things that I've studied a bunch, a phenomenon called computational irreducibility, that basically tells one that figuring out, just saying, oh, I know what's going to happen, it's going to be this. There's sort of an inevitable chain of unintended consequences that happen when you try and do these kinds of simulations. So it's a challenging thing. But in terms of the sort of physics of, can you do things that will, for example, cool the surface of the Earth? The answer is absolutely. And will they be significant in terms of is it sort of possible with things that could really be done without costing, you know, trillions of dollars? Is it possible to make changes? The answer is almost certainly yes. And it's probably a lot cheaper to do that than just to say, let's shut down all industrial production of this or that. To achieve the same thing. But it is also, it's always a difficult thing to know, you know, what exactly will the consequences of one of these pieces of geoengineering be. But it's an interesting area of particularly sort of technology and science, and inevitably public policy as well. Let's see. It's a question from Pranjul here, asking, how do birds fly? And is it difficult to understand and mimic it? That's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I know fully the answer to that question. So back in the 1800s, people were very interested in, could one make a flying machine? And the most obvious approach would be mimic a bird. You see birds flying around all over the place. Let's just do what birds do. And so there's some wonderful movies of this kind of thing, of people with their flapping, you know, flying machines, which were just bird-like, and a lot of unfortunate things of people jumping off, you know, tall things with various flapping contraptions to try and fly like birds, and it didn't work very well. The kind of engineering constraints on a bird are fairly different from humans. Birds are rather light. They have very airy bones, and they have they don't have the same kind of dense bones that we do, and so on. They tend to be quite light. But what was realized, and kind of the achievement of the Wight brothers back, you know, when they first were flying planes, one of the big achievements was, it wasn't so much about getting the lift to keep the plane up in the air. The big thing was having the plane not become unstable and sort of tip to one side and end up in a situation where it couldn't get the lift to keep it aloft. Because, you know, you can make a glider where you can say you've got this, or a kite for that matter, where you say, I've got this thing, and you can kind of keep it, you know, you can, well, for example, if you just have a sort of a single wing, and you just make it, and you know, run it forwards through the air, if the wing is tipped up a bit, it will get lift and it will be pulled up. The issue is, if you want to control it, if you want to take it off, turn it around, land it, and so on, how does that work? And that's hard. And the thing that the Wight brothers figured out is how to get better control of a thing that was flying through the air. And they had a whole elaborate scheme, which I don't think is really used. It's, what was it, wing warping and things, where they actually twist the wings slightly and so on. People found slightly simpler ways to do the same thing. But the main thing that was achieved there was being able to control it so that it was stable. And that's the main issue, I think, with flapping devices, is controlling them so they're stable is tough. Now, by the way, one of the new kinds of flying machines that wasn't common in the past, but is very common today, is drones. Drones typically have, let's say 4 downward pointing propellers, and they're held up by the air being pushed down by those propellers. The question is, why weren't drones built years ago? And the answer is, well, partly it's because of battery technology and being able to keep enough energy in the drone to have it flying for a while. But more important was, even for a short amount of time, you couldn't maintain stability of the drone. The thing would be always, it would, one side would tip up and then the whole thing would tip over and so on. You have to have a flight controller, a microprocessor in the drone that can figure out, oh, I'm noticing my accelerometer tells me that one side is going up, the other side's going down. Okay, change the speed of this rotor, this propeller slightly, and that, to make the thing become stable. And so that was a piece of mathematics, control theory, that let one understand how to produce that kind of stability. And then a question of how to implement that using fast enough that you could actually not have the thing become unstable and the instability make it fall out of the sky and so on. So the problem of flight, of even things like a drone with 4 propellers and so on, it's a lot of it is the story of how do you control it. Now, birds have brains, and so they, in a sense, had it easier because they had sort of an onboard flight controller from the get-go, so to speak. And I suspect a lot of what's involved in bird flight has to do with the way the control works. Of, oh yeah, you're an eagle, put that wing down slightly because that way you won't fall over. Just like when we walk, we have a pretty elaborate system that allows us to not fall over, even though, gosh, it seems completely crazy to be able to walk on 2 legs. But yet we have a control system that prevents us from falling over using things like the balance organs in our ears and so on. And using our brain to decide, oh, well, you actually have to put a little bit more force on that side to stop tipping over in that way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's a large part of the story. And, could you make a flapping device that would fly these days with more modern controller technology? I suspect the answer is yes. I don't think it's a particularly good way to do it, because I think that with birds, because of the way muscles work, it's good to flap. If you are using machinery, it's good to turn, like a propeller, for example, which, in biology, we don't have a lot of examples of places where things turn like wheels. Sometimes in bacteria, they have these flagella that are actually made. If you look at them at an electron microscope or something, you can actually see they'll typically have this ring of molecules around them in which they're basically turning like a little motor. They're turning that little sort of tail-like thing. But it's pretty rare in biology to find wheel-like things out there. And so that happens to be something that's technologically easy for us to build. It's not so easy for us to build flapping things, and it's not as convenient a piece of engineering. So that's why I suspect we haven't seen a lot of flapping stuff out there technologically flying. I mean, there's a lot of complexity in flight. For example, for insects, I think a lot of insects, when they fly, and I'm not going to be able to do this, when they fly, as they bring their wings back, their wings actually touch as they come up. And I think there's a whole lot of elaborate aerodynamics as the wings pull apart when they're going to do a downstroke. There's a lot of elaborate stuff that happens there. But it's my impression that there's pretty decent understanding of the aerodynamics of how birds and even insects fly. And it just isn't very technologically sensible to make flapping flying machines at this time. Let's see. Looking at. Oh boy, okay. Okay, there's a question here from Martian, refers to a previous question. What does it mean when a paper is peer reviewed? Who are the peers? Okay, so one of the ideas in academic journals and so on is somebody writes a paper, and then the idea is to get other scientists to read that paper and say whether they think it's right or not. And at some point in the past, it's actually fairly recent, I think, fairly much the last 50 years, which is recent by some standards, this notion of anonymous peer review. So you send your paper into a journal, and then the editor of the journal, the person who's in charge of what goes into the journal, will say, okay, this paper seems to be about this and this and this. I'm going to send it to, Jim and Jane and Bob and whoever to review it. And we're going to have those reviewers be anonymous to the author. So one of them might say, I think this paper is great. Another one might say, I think this paper is nonsense. Another one might say something else. They write up reports. Those get sent back to the original author of the paper. And the idea is that this is sort of a fair way to figure out whether that paper is good or not. In practice, this system works horribly. And it's a good idea in principle. It's a super bad idea in practice. Why does it work horribly? Well, one reason I think it works horribly is, one thing is, it's like, why would somebody do this anonymous peer review? What's in it for the reviewer? It's like, well, one reason is sometimes if it's a person who's earlier in their career, it's like, well, I wanted to read this paper anyway, might as well read it and make comments on it. Great. But a lot of times it's like, well, if I'm going to review this paper, then, if the paper is nice to my work and has a lot of citations to my work and so on, then great, let me accept this paper so that it's kind of a natural selection thing so that my own work propagates better. If the paper is against my work, then, I better reject this paper because I don't want that out there in the world. Now, you might say that's not a very, that's not good intellectual integrity to do that, and it's not. And sadly, that's a very, very common thing that happens. And so, that's one phenomenon. Another phenomenon is, oh yeah, this paper is by my friend so-and-so, sure, I'm sure it's okay. Stamp on it goes. Now, people sometimes try and deal with that by removing the name of the author from the paper that gets sent out for review. That also doesn't work very well because papers contain, people tend to refer to their own work, they'll mention their own work, so it's not too hard to figure out whose it is. And also in modern times, most people post their papers as preprints. I should have said, most papers that ever get written these days get posted on the web before they are published. And most people who are going to read these papers read them before they're, quotes, published. But there's still this kind of whole system of academic journals, hundreds of thousands of journals that publish things in particular areas. And in a sense, it's a stamp of approval that your paper, and usually many journals, it's like you send your paper to one journal and not other journals. It's like if it's published in this journal, then it can't be published in any other journal. Not always the case, but that's usually how it works. And in a sense, to be published in Journal X is kind of a stamp of approval that the kind of the reviewers and the editor and so on of that journal thought, oh yeah, your paper is good. It's kind of a way of doing selection of content and so on. And also at universities, it's often this idea of sort of how many peer-reviewed papers have you published? That is what determines things like, do you get that promotion? Do you get the pay increase, et cetera? So in any case, it's unfortunately, the system is sort of fraught with difficulties. And I have to say, I've not been a believer in it for a long time. I mean, I know when I used to, I get asked to review papers all the time, but I haven't done it for years. When I used to do it, I always used to say, look, if I'm going to write something about this, at least I want the authors to know that I put the time into reading their stuff and writing something about it. I'm going to sign my review. And it's like, And a lot of journals were like, you can't do that. This is supposed to be anonymous. And it's like, why is it anonymous? It's anonymous to protect me, so to speak. I don't want to be protected. I'm happy to just, tell the authors whatever I'm telling them. Either, look, I don't think your paper is correct. Why don't you do this instead? Or looks great, or whatever it is. But it was sort of interesting to see that that was a thing that really confused people. I tend to think that anything that gets done in terms of the kind of review of it's useful to know that somebody read something and they thought it was good, because that gives you more of an indication that maybe you would understand it and think it was interesting too. But I think that doing that as a sort of open process is a much better idea than this kind of mysterious, some magic peer will review this thing. I have to tell you that I don't want to corrupt anybody here, but there's a journal that I started, how long ago is it now? 34 years ago. I haven't been involved in in what it publishes for years and years and years, but I know that the people who've edited it, one of the problems that they can have is if you send papers to senior people in a field, they'll always have kind of axes to grind. They'll say, oh no, that person who's writing this paper comes from the rival group that is blah, 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 blah. And although the senior people might know more about the subject, they also have many more kind of prejudices about what's going on. And so the optimal people to send papers to, if you actually want somebody to read the thing, are these more junior people who might know a little bit less, but they don't have as, there isn't the same kind of prejudice there. And you get a more accurate assessment of whether the thing is interesting and has something good to say. Let's see. Okay, there's a question here. Oh my gosh, you guys are asking so many questions. Let's see. Okay, there's a question from Udesio saying, I want to teach science to my 3-year-old sister. What subject should I teach? That's a good, challenging one. I think one of the things I noticed, okay, I have 4 kids, they have different levels of interest in science. And one of the things I've noticed is as soon as they were curious about something, if there was something interesting to tell them about it, great. If they weren't curious, kind of it's not so easy to, you can explain a bunch of stuff, but you have to do a really good job selling it. So sort of the natural curiosity thing is always a really good driver. But there are situations in which you will be somewhere, and if you point something out as, oh, look at that thing, and then the kid is like, I wonder why that happens that way, or I wonder what happens if you do this or that. That's a good start. I think also sometimes I'm not sure. 3 years old, I'm challenging, not sure what the right answer to that is. I think there are all kinds of things to do with, I think one of the things that can happen is, here's a sort of funny thing that can happen, a cautionary tale, right? You show some kid something where the big thing is that some liquid turns green, let's say. It was transparent, it turns green. But and to you that may be very significant, but to the kid, the fact that you have this thing and it's this glassware and it's got all kinds of boiling stuff in it and so on, that's the thing that's significant to them. The fact that, oh, there's this thing that turned green, it's like, I didn't even notice that. So sometimes the thing that, sometimes it's kind of an acquired taste to know what it is that you should be noticing, so to speak. And so I think it's you have to pick things where you have to be a little bit careful to pick things where it's really a very obvious thing that happened. I don't know. I'm trying to think for that age group. I don't know. I always used to claim to my wife that I couldn't deal with children under the age of 10. And that set a low expectation. So when our kids were younger than 10, the fact that I could interact with them at all was seen as a bonus, so to speak. But in any case, the yeah, I'm trying to think. There are probably some things. I mean, the other thing is sometimes there are things where you'll learn something at one age, you'll understand it in a certain way, but it doesn't really do you much good because it doesn't really connect to how you learn it later on. And it doesn't really, like, for example, you can teach kids to read when they're really, really young. But it doesn't really seem to stick. And it doesn't, and they end up having to relearn how to read a bit later usually. And it's not clear it really had an advantage to do that. I think that, I think one of the things that can happen is, what is it that stimulates sort of natural curiosity? I don't really know. My sort of pseudo meta theory is that everybody is born with a considerable degree of natural curiosity. And the only thing that really happens is that people get sort of talked out of it, so to speak. And that so long as people are not talked out of it, all is good and the curiosity remains. And I think sometimes even if you explain things too much, sometimes that can be a problem because it's like, oh, everything that happens has an explanation and there's it's complicated. And as I say, I don't know for that age group. Let's see. It's a comment here. Today's aerodynamics are actually based on bird physics. Not so sure about that. We don't have a lot of feathered birds. And I know some of the details of what's done on airplane wings is I don't know. Okay. Let's see. Aha, there's a comment here from Udesio. In Brazil, we do not learn that the Wright brothers invented the airplane, but instead a person named Carlos Drummont, a Brazilian. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it is a curious thing. I know television is one thing where, depending on what country you're in, you will learn a different inventor for television. Sometimes, there is, the history of inventions can be very complicated. It's like somebody had the idea, but they didn't quite make it work. Oh, somebody had this thing and it was a sort of a plane and it went for 100 feet. But then somebody else had a thing that really flew around the Paris Air Show and did something very impressive. And it's like, well, where was it really invented? There's often a big issue with sort of where was the original idea, who actually made it work. Sometimes even the person who made it work didn't take it the distance it could have got. And they really didn't. I mean, I think a famous example, Heinrich Hertz, right? The discoverer of radio, made it was 1880 something, I think. James Clerk Maxwell had worked out the mathematical equations for electromagnetism. And he worked out this fact that there should be electromagnetic waves, which are things with oscillating electricity and magnetism, and electromagnetic waves are what are radio, as well as light, as well as X-rays, as well as other kinds of things. But people didn't know that radio was possible. And this chap, Heinrich Hertz, managed to build a little device that produced generated a spark somewhere and picked up the effect of that somewhere else. And therefore proved that James Clerk Maxwell's theory of electromagnetic waves was correct. And I think somebody asked him, is there any use for this idea of radio, of electromagnetic, of transmitting electromagnetic waves? And he said, well, it shows that James Clerk Maxwell's sort of footnote in his book, it wasn't quite a footnote, but it was a section in his book about electromagnetic waves was correct. This is as far as it goes. Of course, in reality, people like Marconi and so on realized, well, actually, radio has a lot of implications and lots of things you can do with radio. And there started the giant set of uses of radio. I mean, it didn't help that people imagined that radio always just went in straight lines. And so it was a big surprise when radio was found to bounce off layers in the Earth's ionosphere, which allowed one to have radio transmissions where you could start from Europe and have a radio transmission that could be picked up in America. And that was something which made that a lot more useful than people had imagined it would be. Let's see. Okay, there's one comment here from Symbio regarding climate change. If all the glaciers melt, how will coastal cities keep the water back? It's interesting. I don't know the full details, but there's some countries in the world, like the Netherlands, for example, which are fundamentally below sea level and have had to have dikes for centuries. And I remember many, many years ago visiting a group in the Netherlands, and they were explaining to me that they were a group that worked on soil mechanics, which is important if you think about dikes. And they were explaining that there was they were working on the 400-year plan for the way that the dikes in the Netherlands would operate. And I was just impressed because nobody has a 400-year plan for things. People might have, if you're very lucky, a few-year plan, but a 400-year plan, that's really an impressive thing. I mean, I think that the problem of actually building things like dikes is not particularly hard. I mean, it's a well understood thing that's been known, since antiquity, sort of how to do that, for your beachfront property or whatever, that can be, that's an issue. But in terms of just the mechanics of how to direct oceans to, how to keep the oceans out, I think the Netherlands have, as an example of a place which has solved that problem for a long period of time. That's a question here, sort of a personal question, and I do think I have to go in a moment here, from Drogoriff, asking, how many hours of sleep do I get? The answer is very boring. I aim to get your average, adult 8 hours of sleep. I think, of course, I measure all these things, so I know how much sleep I actually get, and it's usually just under 7 hours. I think it's my theory about these things is any time that people have different ways of working, and I've sort of slowly tried to do the best I can for myself. But the theory of let me stay up all night to work really hard on this thing, it'll get it done quicker than if I sleep. And if I push myself to the maximum and don't sleep and so on, then it'll be done quicker. That has not been my experience, because my experience is by the time I'm sufficiently tired, I find it hard to sort of figure out what to do correctly and so on. And it's always been a better optimization for me. Try to get enough sleep, and then I'll be awake and capable of figuring stuff out. And that's that tends to be a better calculation. I suppose that it's a terrible admission that the nature of my life is such that I very rarely, absolutely definitively have to get up by a certain time, and so I tend to have I almost never end up needing to use an alarm clock and all those kinds of things, and that probably helps my. I'm sure for lots of kids who are like, well, if they're going to school at some early time of day, or even going in some sense of going, whatever that means today, that tends to be that can affect. You're kind of forced to be up at a certain time, and that probably does all kinds of terrible things to one's ability to sort of sleep long and prosper, so to speak. Okay, I think we need to wrap up here. And actually, I am about to do another live stream about a completely different topic. We are in the we are just finishing a new version of our Wolfram language software system. It's version 12.2, so that means we're kind of trying to wrap up a bunch of design reviews for it, and that's what I do for a living, is try and lead our efforts to make great technology, and our company to do that. And so I got to go do some day job work, but I'm going to live stream it because we've been live streaming a lot of our kind of internal design reviews. I think this one is about geography and dates. So I think I have to sign off here for today, and I look forward. I think I'll be been trying to do this every week at the same time. I'll see you then. And for people who are interested in more technical things, by all means, join the live stream that we are about to do about geography and dates in making those computable. Okay, great. Thanks so much. Bye for now.